You begin with a confidence that seems natural, the belief that what you know is true simply because it appears coherent. You assume that clarity guarantees correctness and that the mind, when satisfied, rests on reliable ground. Yet the moment you examine this assumption, even slightly, its stability weakens. You notice that certainty often forms before verification and that familiarity is frequently mistaken for truth. Al-Ghazali confronted this issue early in his inquiry. He recognized that the mind's conclusions depend on untested assumptions, inherited patterns, and unnoticed fears. When you observe your own thinking carefully, you see that certainty is not a measure of truth but a reflection of what the mind chooses to accept. If certainty arises without examination, how do you know whether it is truth or comfort? Al-Ghazali lived in a world shaped by rigorous intellectual activity. In the academies of Baghdad, scholars debated law, philosophers refined logical systems, and theologians defended doctrinal boundaries. Rational inquiry was considered the highest path to understanding, and intellectual mastery promised access to certainty. Yet within this environment, Al-Ghazali sensed a deeper problem. The pursuit of knowledge created the impression of clarity, but it did not resolve the question of truth itself. The structures of thought were elaborate, but the foundation on which they rested remained unexamined. If a world built on knowledge still struggles with doubt, what anchors certainty? Al-Ghazali reached a point where every category of knowledge appeared uncertain. Sense perception could be mistaken, memory could deceive, and logical reasoning depended on premises the mind accepted without proof. He realized that the mind verifies truth using the very instrument whose reliability is in question. You see a similar pattern in yourself. You rely on the mind to confirm its own conclusions, even though the mind is influenced by preference, habit, and fear. When this becomes clear, knowledge no longer feels secure. The crisis is not the discovery of falsehood, it is the discovery of the mind's limits. If the tool of knowing is itself uncertain, how do you confirm anything it concludes? Reason offers structure, coherence, and clarity. It organizes experience into categories and draws conclusions that appear consistent. But when reason is examined closely, you notice that it cannot ground itself. It explains how things relate to one another, but it cannot justify the basic assumptions that allow explanation to occur. Al-Ghazali understood this limitation. He used reason to evaluate arguments, yet he saw that reason cannot establish its own foundation. It depends on principles that cannot be proven by reasoning itself. You begin to see that logic, while powerful, is not the source of certainty. It is only a method. If reason cannot validate its own roots, can it truly determine what is unquestionable? At this point, the inquiry shifts inward. You begin to see that understanding is not produced solely by intellect. The heart, not as emotion, but as the inner faculty of perception, shapes how truth appears. When the heart is burdened by desire, fear, or attachment, its reflections become distorted. Knowledge becomes selective, influenced by what the self wants to preserve. Al-Ghazali emphasized that clarity requires purification of intention. A mind influenced by inner tension cannot observe truth without distortion. To know reality, the observing self must be transparent. The heart becomes a mirror, and understanding appears only when the mirror is clean. If the heart shapes perception, can truth be seen before the heart is free from influence? Doubt becomes a discipline rather than a threat. You begin to question not to destroy certainty but to uncover what certainty relies on. You examine beliefs you once accepted automatically and trace the origins of your convictions. Through this discipline, you discover layers of assumption that were hidden beneath familiarity. Al-Ghazali treated doubt as a necessary stage of transformation. He saw that unexamined belief cannot lead to insight. Only through questioning can understanding free itself from the influence of preference and fear. Doubt removes what is false so that what remains can be trusted. If you never question the ground on which certainty stands, how do you know what supports your conclusions? As your examination deepens, you see that doubt reveals more than intellectual instability. It exposes a deeper issue, fear. You notice that certain questions make you uncomfortable not because they are unsolvable but because their answers might require you to abandon familiar assumptions. Fear becomes visible not as an emotion but as a boundary the mind quietly imposes on itself. Al-Ghazali identified this dynamic with precision. He realized that fear limits inquiry long before inquiry begins. The mind avoids particular questions by disguising avoidance as prudence, stability, or respect for tradition. What you call caution often emerges from an unspoken desire to protect the self from disruption. When you observe this mechanism directly, the structure of understanding shifts. You begin to ask why certain conclusions feel threatening. You explore whether the discomfort arises from truth itself or from the implications truth might carry. This transparency allows inquiry to continue without the constraints imposed by fear. If fear determines what you allow yourself to examine, can any conclusion reached under its influence be trusted? You begin to see that fear disguises itself in subtle forms. It presents itself as rational caution, the desire for stability, or the claim that certain questions are unnecessary. You may tell yourself that questioning long-held beliefs shows disloyalty or that challenging established ideas is reckless. Yet when examined closely, these justifications reveal an underlying attempt to protect a familiar sense of self. Al-Ghazali observed that fear speaks in the language of reason. It offers arguments that appear logical but are structured to maintain comfort rather than reveal truth. This creates the illusion of safety, the belief that holding tightly to established views protects you from uncertainty. But safety is not clarity. What feels stable may prevent you from seeing what is real. When fear operates silently, it becomes the hidden architect of understanding. Only when its influence is recognized does the possibility of genuine inquiry appear. You begin to ask whether your commitment to certain ideas arises from truth or from the desire to preserve identity. The distinction becomes central to the search for understanding. If fear can appear as reason, how do you distinguish between what you believe and why you believe it? A deeper shift occurs when you recognize that fear is not merely a reaction but a structure within the act of thinking. It influences which possibilities you consider, how you interpret uncertainty, and what you regard as acceptable evidence. You discover that the mind does not simply analyze, it filters. And the filter is shaped by what the mind seeks to avoid. Al-Ghazali treated this recognition as the beginning of purification, not moral purification, but purification of perception. When you see the influence of fear clearly, you begin to separate thought from the tension that distorts it. The observer becomes more transparent, and the act of knowing becomes less restricted. This recognition does not remove fear, but it exposes the role fear plays in shaping thought. You begin to understand that clarity arises when the mind stops defending itself. Thought becomes quieter, less reactive, more open to what is actually present. In this shift, understanding no longer feels like something you impose on reality. It becomes something you allow to reveal itself. If the observer is shaped by fear, how can anything it observes be entirely free from distortion? With this awareness, you begin to see how perception operates. Meaning does not arise from neutral observation. It forms through the inner lens that precedes interpretation. Fear narrows this lens. It defines what you consider possible, sets limits on what you allow yourself to understand, and influences the conclusions you draw before you consciously think them. Al-Ghazali emphasized that fear enters before perception, not after. It shapes the field of attention, determines which aspects of experience you focus on, and decides which interpretations you accept. Until this lens is recognized, truth cannot be distinguished from preference, and understanding remains confined by the boundaries fear establishes. As you observe this process, perception becomes more transparent. You begin to see how much of what you call knowledge is filtered by inner conditions rather than external reality. This does not discredit knowledge, it clarifies its limitations. When the lens becomes visible, you can finally examine how it functions. Its influence weakens simply because it is seen. If every perception is shaped by an inner lens, how do you know which part belongs to the world and which part belongs to the self? Insight does not arise from accumulating arguments. It emerges when obstruction ends. You see that understanding is not something the mind constructs, but something revealed when the mind becomes clear. The movement from confusion to clarity is not the result of new information, but the result of removing what distorts perception. Al-Ghazali described this as a transformation within the observer. When the mind stops defending itself, insight appears naturally without force. Reason continues to function, but it no longer serves fear. It becomes an instrument of clarity rather than protection. If understanding appears when obstruction ends, what remains when nothing obstructs? At the end of the inquiry, thought grows quiet. Not because the questions are resolved through argument, but because the mind recognizes the limits of what it can claim. When fear falls silent, the need to defend interpretations dissolves. Understanding becomes a form of stillness, a clarity that does not insist, argue, or demand certainty. Al-Ghazali saw that truth does not belong to the thinker. It reveals itself when thinking ceases to interfere. In this silence, there is no claim, no conclusion, no possession of knowledge. There is only awareness free from distortion. When the searcher stops defending understanding, what remains to obscure truth?